Hello everyone and welcome back to Unsaid Hours. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. You already know what is coming. Jonathan Harker told you. He wrote it all down in the castle, in the dark, with hands that shook sometimes and sometimes did not. He wrote about the driver whose eyes reflected light wrong. He wrote about the mirror that showed only one person when there were two in the room. He wrote about 52 boxes of dark earth being prepared for a journey west. He warned you, but warning is only useful if the right people receive it in time. The right people did not receive it in time. By the time Jonathan made it back to England, by the time he had recovered enough from what the castle had done to him to speak clearly about what he had seen, something had already happened. Something had already arrived. Something very old and very patient had already begun to move through London, the way that old patient things move through new places, quietly, carefully, learning the streets, learning the people, learning where the dark was deepest and where no one was watching. This is the second part of the story. It is darker than the first part. You have been warned about that too. Turn off the lights, settle in. This is where it gets worse. Mina's diary begins where Jonathan's leaves off. Her name was Mina Murray, soon to be Mina Harker, and she was waiting for Jonathan to come back from Transylvania. She was practical and intelligent, and she kept a diary because Jonathan kept a diary, and she believed, as he did, that writing things down was how you made sense of the world. She was writing things down while Jonathan was in the castle. She did not know what was happening to him while she wrote. She knew only that his letters had become less frequent and then had stopped, and that she was worried in the specific way of someone who is trying very hard not to be worried, because being worried will not help, and there is nothing practical to do with the worry except feel it. She felt it. She kept writing. Her diary in those weeks is the diary of a young woman doing the things that young women did, visiting friends, taking walks, writing letters, helping with the correspondence of her employer. It is cheerful and observant, and underneath the cheerfulness there is the worry, not stated, not dramatized, just there in the way she writes about small things, the extra care she takes with details, the way a person pays attention to the ordinary world when they are afraid that something they love has gone wrong and they cannot yet know it. She had a friend staying with her during this time, a woman named Lucy. Lucy is where the second part of the story really begins. Lucy Westenra was everything that sounds pleasant to describe. She was young and beautiful and full of life in the specific way of people who have not yet had serious cause to doubt that life will continue to be good to them. She laughed easily. She was generous. She was the kind of person that other people felt better for being around, not because she was particularly wise or because she said important things, but because her energy was warm and she shared it freely. She had 3 men who wanted to marry her. This is not vanity, not the kind of thing that gets recorded because she was vain about it. It is relevant because of what happens later, because of what those 3 men do when what happens to Lucy begins to happen, because of how they respond and what they try and why it is not enough. She chose one of the 3. His name was Arthur Holmwood, and she loved him, and she was happy in the way of someone who has found what they were looking for and knows it. She was happy in June. By August, she was not happy. By August, she was something else entirely. It began so small that Mina almost missed it. They were staying together at a seaside town called Whitby on the east coast of England. It was a summer holiday, the kind that people took then, a change of air and scene, a rest from the ordinary routine. Whitby was a good place for it, an old town on a cliff above the sea. with a ruined abbey on the headland and a harbor below, and the North Sea stretching away to the east in all its cold, gray enormity. Mina liked Whitby. She wrote about it with genuine pleasure, about the walks along the cliff top and the view from the abbey, and the particular smell of the sea air in the evenings. She was happy there, or as happy as she could be, with Jonathan still silent and her worry still present. Lucy was happy there too. She walked and she talked and she laughed and she received letters from Arthur and wrote letters back. And in the evenings they sat together and Mina wrote in her diary and Lucy read or dozed. And then Lucy started walking in her sleep. The first time Mina woke in the night to find the bed beside her empty. She got up and found Lucy at the window of their room, standing in her nightgown, looking out at the sea, completely asleep. She led her back to bed. Lucy woke in the morning with no memory of it. The second time, Lucy was not in the room at all. Mina searched the house and did not find her. She went outside into the night, down the street and up toward the cliff, where the abbey ruins stood dark against the darker sky, and found Lucy there on one of the old tomb seats, in the churchyard above the harbor, lying back, her white nightgown bright against the dark stone, her head turned to one side. There was something beside her. Mina saw it before she understood what she was seeing. A dark shape at Lucy's throat, something that resolved as she got closer into a figure, very tall, very still, bending over Lucy in a posture that made Mina's feet stop without her deciding to stop them. Then it was gone. She cannot say how it went. It was there, and then it was not, between one blink and the next, in the way that things in the dark are sometimes there and then not. And afterward she told herself she had not seen it clearly, that the dark had played tricks, that there had been no figure. But Lucy's throat, when Mina reached her and knelt beside her, had two small marks on it, on the left side, very close together, like the marks of something that had pressed there with great precision. They were barely visible, just two small red points. Nothing alarming, the kind of thing you could easily dismiss, easily explain away. Mina dismissed it. She explained it away. She helped Lucy up and walked her home and put her to bed, and told herself it was nothing, that she had imagined the shape in the dark, that the marks were perhaps from a pin or a piece of jewelry that had caught in sleep. She wrote it down, though. She wrote all of it down, the shape and the marks and the feeling she had had when her feet stopped, the specific feeling that she writes about carefully, the feeling of encountering something that every part of her body recognized as wrong before her mind had caught up. She wrote it, and then she wrote that she was probably being foolish and that tomorrow everything would be normal. Tomorrow Lucy was pale. The paleness was the first real sign looking back. At the time it was easy to account for bad sleep, the night air, the slight chill that came off the sea, even in summer. Lucy said she felt fine, slightly tired, nothing more. She ate breakfast and smiled and was herself mostly, but she was slightly less herself than she had been. This is the way these things work, which is what makes them so difficult to recognize when they are happening. Not a dramatic change, not a sudden collapse, but a slow diminishing, so gradual that on any given day, you could look at Lucy and say she was fine and be correct by the measurements of that single day, without seeing what you would see if you could compare her to herself 3 weeks ago. Mina saw it. She saw it because she was paying attention, and because she loved Lucy, and because the worry she already had for Jonathan had made her watchful in a general way, alert to changes, less willing than she might otherwise have been to look away from things that made her uncomfortable. She watched Lucy get paler. She watched the marks on her throat. They did not go away. They were still there, days later, still those two small, precise points on the left side, not healing the way a small wound heals, not fading, just remaining, as if whatever had made them had left something behind that kept them open. She wrote to Lucy's doctor. The doctor came and looked at Lucy and said she was anemic, that she needed rest and iron and fresh air. He said it with the confidence of a man who has a diagnosis that fits the visible symptoms and sees no reason to look for another one. He gave his advice and left. Lucy rested. She ate what she was supposed to eat. She slept, or she tried to sleep, and her sleep was troubled in ways she described to Mina in the mornings with a bewildered honesty, that she dreamed of things she could not quite remember, that she woke feeling not rested but more tired than when she had gone to bed, that the dreams had a quality she could not name. She continued to get paler. The ship came to Whitby in a storm. It came from the east, from somewhere out in the North Sea, in the middle of a night when the storm was bad enough that the people of Whitby had come to the harbor to watch it, because storms like this did not come often, and when they did, they were worth watching, even if they were also frightening. The ship came in out of the dark and the storm, moving with a speed that was wrong for a ship in those seas, a speed that suggested either extraordinary luck or something other than luck, and it came straight into the harbor and ran aground. The people of Whitby who went aboard the next morning found the ship empty. Not damaged, not wrecked in any meaningful way. The cargo was intact. The rigging was intact. Everything was in order except that there was no crew anywhere on the ship, not below decks, not anywhere, as if the ship had sailed itself across the North Sea and into the harbor. The captain was found lashed to the wheel, dead, his hands tied to the wheel so that even in death he would not let go, would not leave his post. His expression was not the expression of a man who had died of natural causes or of any ordinary cause. It was the expression of a man who had been very afraid for a long time and had died still afraid. His log was found with him. The log told the story of the journey from its beginning. A cargo of wooden boxes, 50 in number, picked up at a port in Eastern Europe, the journey west. And then, somewhere in the middle of the North Sea, things had begun to go wrong. Men disappearing, one by one, no explanation, no bodies found. Just men who had been there and then were not, and the remaining men growing more frightened with each disappearance, sleeping less, watching each other, watching the cargo hold where the boxes sat in the dark, until there was only the captain left, and the captain knew there was only the captain left, and he lashed himself to the wheel because letting go was not an option he was willing to consider. He wrote his last entry in the log the night before the ship came into Whitby harbor. He wrote that he had seen it. He did not say what it was. He wrote only that he had seen it, and that he understood now what had happened to his men, and that he was not going to leave the wheel, and that God helped the people of the shore toward which they were sailing. The boxes were unloaded from the ship the next day by workers who had no idea what they were unloading. 50 boxes of earth from Transylvania, addressed to a property outside London. Mina received a letter from Jonathan, not from the castle, from a hospital in Budapest, where he had been taken by nuns who had found him wandering near the border, delirious with fever, speaking in languages that mixed together in ways that suggested his mind had not fully returned from wherever the castle had taken it. He was alive. She went to him immediately. She took the first train she could get, crossed the Channel, traveled east across Europe to the hospital in Budapest, and walked into the room where he was and saw him. He was alive, but he was not the same. He was thinner. He was quieter. His eyes had a quality that she had not seen in them before, a watchfulness that did not switch off even in sleep, the watchfulness of someone who has learned that what you do not see can still find you. He held her hand when she sat beside his bed, and he did not let go for a long time. He told her some of it. Not everything, not yet, not while he was still recovering in the hospital with the fever not yet entirely gone, but some of it, the parts that mattered most, the parts she needed to know. She listened. She did not tell him she did not believe him. She had been to the churchyard above the harbor at Whitby, and she had seen the shape at Lucy's throat, and she had written about it in her diary with that careful, honest writing that was her habit. She had already begun to update her understanding of what the world contained. She believed him. They were married in the hospital chapel, quietly, with 2 of the nuns as witnesses, because they had been separated long enough, and because neither of them wanted to wait for a more proper occasion. She became Mina Harker on a gray morning in Budapest, with the smell of antiseptic in the air and Jonathan's hand still thin in hers. Then they came home. Lucy was worse when Mina got back. She had been worse while Mina was gone, according to the letters that had found Mina on the road, getting progressively shorter and more alarming. By the time Mina was back in England and could see Lucy for herself, the change was not gradual anymore. It was visible. It was urgent. Lucy was very pale, not the ordinary paleness of someone who has been ill, but the specific pallor of something essential being taken from her, the color of deep loss. She was thin in a way she had not been. She slept constantly and woke unrefreshed. The marks on her throat were still there, and they were, if anything, more defined than before, as if whatever had made them was being renewed regularly. Her mother was with her, an older woman, not in good health herself, who watched her daughter with eyes that knew something was very wrong and did not know what to do with that knowledge. The 3 men who loved Lucy in their different ways were also gathering. Arthur, who was going to marry her, was there most of the time, sitting with her, holding her hand, being as present as love makes a person when the person they love is diminishing in front of them. The other 2, a doctor named John Seward, who ran an asylum nearby, and an American named Quincy Morris from Texas, who had known Lucy since before either of them had grown up, came and went, all 3 of them doing what people do when someone they love is sick and the medicine is not working, which is to be there, to be present, to offer the company of themselves even when there is nothing practical they can do. It was John Seward who wrote to his old teacher. His name was Abraham Van Helsing. He was Dutch, a doctor and a professor, a man of science who had spent a long career studying things that other men of science preferred not to study, things that existed at the edges of what medicine and science could comfortably explain. He was old and he was very clever, and when John Seward wrote to him describing Lucy's symptoms, he came immediately. He came and he looked at Lucy, and he looked at the marks on her throat, and he looked at the men in the room, and he said nothing for a long time. Then he asked for garlic. Not garlic as medicine, not garlic in any form that John Seward, who was a rational and modern doctor, could immediately account for. Garlic flowers, hung around the room, around the windows, around the door, placed at Lucy's throat. John Seward watched his old teacher do this and wrote in his own diary, which he kept on a phonograph, recording his voice rather than his handwriting, that he did not understand what Van Helsing was doing and was trying to trust that it had a rational basis that would be explained in time. Van Helsing did not explain it yet, but Lucy slept better that night than she had slept in weeks. She woke in the morning with more color in her face. She was almost herself. For one day she was almost herself. Then her mother, who did not know why the garlic was there because no one had explained it to her, removed it from the windows because she thought the smell was unpleasant and she did not want her daughter's room smelling of garlic. She opened the windows. She meant well. She could not have known. The next morning Lucy was worse than she had ever been. Van Helsing understood what this meant. He did not say so directly, not yet, not to the others. He was a careful man who understood that what he knew and what others were ready to hear were 2 different things, and that saying the true thing too soon to people who were not ready for it was the same as not saying it, because they would not receive it. He began to prepare them. He did this slowly. He asked John Seward questions, careful questions about what he had observed in Lucy, about the marks, about the progression of her decline, about the nights specifically. He asked Arthur to describe Lucy's behavior in detail. He listened to all of it with total attention, the attention of a man who is assembling a picture from pieces and already knows what the picture is and is checking whether the pieces confirm it. They confirmed it. He ordered more garlic. He arranged for someone to be with Lucy at all times. He asked for the windows to be kept closed and latched, and for nothing to be admitted to the room after dark, no matter what sounds might come from outside, no matter what might seem to ask for entry. John Seward wrote in his phonograph diary that Van Helsing had said something strange when he gave this last instruction. He had said that the thing that comes will not come in without being invited. He had said that this was a rule it could not break. He had said that no one in the house must invite it, under any circumstances, no matter how reasonable or harmless the request might seem. John Seward wrote that he did not understand what Van Helsing meant. He was beginning to be afraid that he would understand soon. Lucy died on a night in September. She died with the people who loved her around her, which was what she would have wanted, and she looked peaceful at the end in the way that people sometimes look peaceful at the end of something that was not peaceful at all. The body releasing what it has been holding, the face going still. They were relieved. This is the terrible thing they all felt. The specific relief of the end of watching someone you love suffer. The grief was enormous and real and would be with them for a long time. But underneath it, in that first moment, relief. It did not last. Van Helsing stayed at the body for a long time after the others had gone to rest. He stayed alone with Lucy, and he looked at her, and he looked at the marks on her throat, and he looked at her face in the specific way of someone who is checking something, rather than mourning someone. He found what he was checking for, or did not find what he was hoping not to find, which amounted to the same thing. He went to find John Seward. He said, "We need to talk." Children had been going missing near the churchyard. Not for long, not fatally. They came back, the children, found wandering and confused at the edges of the cemetery, pale and with small marks on their throats, and no memory of how they had come to be there. They said a pretty lady had called to them. They described her, and the description was the same from each child. A beautiful pale woman with dark eyes and a white dress, very kind, very gentle, who had asked them to come with her. Van Helsing listened to this. John Seward listened to this. Arthur Holmwood, who had loved Lucy and lost her, listened to this with an expression that was not grief anymore, but something harder and colder and more useful. Van Helsing told them what he had not told them before. He told them what Lucy had become. He told them carefully and completely, with the precision of a scientist and the gentleness of a man who understood what he was asking the people in front of him to accept, because what he was asking them to accept was enormous, and they were people of reason and the modern world, and what he was telling them was ancient and strange, and contradicted everything they had been educated to believe. He told them anyway. He told them because it was true. He told them because they needed to know if they were going to stop it. And he told them what needed to be done. Arthur did not accept it immediately. He could not. He had loved Lucy. The idea of what Van Helsing was describing, of what Lucy had become, of what was being asked of him, was so far outside the boundaries of anything he had prepared himself for that his mind simply would not receive it at first. He sat with it. He thought about the children. He thought about the marks on their throats. He thought about the marks on Lucy's throat that had never healed, and the ship from the east, and the boxes of earth, and all of it together. He said yes. They went to the churchyard at night. Van Helsing carried things that John Seward, watching him pack them, could not have explained the purpose of a week ago, and could explain now: garlic and a crucifix and a wooden stake and a surgeon's saw. He carried them with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who has done this before and knows what is required. They went to Lucy's tomb. Van Helsing opened it. John Seward writes about what they found inside with the tone of a man who is trying very hard to maintain the observational distance of a scientist and finding it extremely difficult. He writes with clinical precision about what the tomb contained and what it did not contain, and then he writes in slightly less clinical language about the quality of it, the wrongness of it. The way the thing in the tomb looked like Lucy and was not Lucy, was something wearing Lucy's face and Lucy's form, and absolutely none of whatever had made Lucy herself. Arthur did what was required. He did it because he loved her. He did it because Van Helsing had explained that what looked like Lucy was not Lucy, that Lucy herself was somewhere else, was free, was at rest, and that the thing in the tomb was the obstacle between Lucy and that rest. He did it, and it was the hardest thing he had ever done. And the writing about it in both John Seward's diary and in Mina's account, which she compiled later from all of their records, treats it with a gentleness and a brevity that is itself a kind of witness to what it cost. Afterward, they stood outside in the cold night air of the churchyard. Van Helsing said, "That is one. Now there is the other." The other was still somewhere in London. He had arrived. He had established himself. He had found his boxes, or enough of them, and he had begun to move through the city in the way that old, patient things move through new places, learning the streets, learning the dark corners, learning which people were alone and which were watched. He had also found Mina Harker. This is the part that Jonathan had not anticipated. The part that came from a direction he had not been watching, because he had been focused on the threat to London in general, to the anonymous millions, without understanding that the thing was also capable of the specific, capable of identifying and pursuing an individual, capable of strategy and spite and the particular attention of something very old that has decided you are a problem. Mina had been helping. She had taken all the diaries, Jonathan's and her own, and John Seward's phonograph recordings, and she had organized them and typed them up and compiled them into a single coherent record, because this was what she was good at, and because a coherent record was what they needed if they were going to plan properly. The Count had read the record. He had gotten into the house where they met, where Mina was, where the record was, and he had read it. And he had understood that this small group of people knew what he was and what he was doing and intended to stop him. He had decided to deal with Mina directly. Jonathan woke in the night to find their room not as he had left it, not different in any obvious way. The furniture was where it had been. The window was closed. The door was closed. Everything was exactly as it had been when he had gone to sleep. Except Mina. Mina was sitting up in the bed with her eyes open, and she was not asleep, and she was not awake in any ordinary way. And there was something in the room with her, something that Jonathan could see, but that his mind resisted seeing, that his mind kept trying to resolve into something else, something that made more sense, because the thing it was resolving into did not make sense, not in the world Jonathan had understood himself to be living in before the castle. He understood now that he had a different world to account for. He did what he could. It was not enough. By the time Van Helsing arrived, by the time the others arrived, the thing was gone, and Mina was sitting on the edge of the bed with her hands in her lap and an expression on her face that Jonathan could not bear to look at directly, because it was the expression of someone who has just been shown something about the world that cannot be unshown. She had marks on her throat, 2 small, precise marks, on the left side. Van Helsing looked at them. He looked at her face. He looked at Jonathan. He said something quietly in Dutch that none of them could translate. Then he said in English very carefully, "We have less time than I thought." The hunt became the thing they all lived inside. They had the record Mina had compiled. They had Van Helsing's knowledge. They had the determination that comes from having already lost one person and being unwilling to lose another. They began to work systematically, the way that people work when they have stopped being afraid and have moved into the territory past fear, the territory of action, where fear is still present, but it has been set aside because there is no time for it. They tracked the boxes. Van Helsing knew that the boxes were the key. The earth from home, the resting places distributed across the city. These were what made the Count safe in London, what allowed him to move freely and rest securely, and avoid being caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. If the boxes could be found and treated, if the earth in them could be made into something the Count could not use, then his options would narrow, and eventually he would have nowhere to go. They began to find the boxes, one by one, property by property, the places where the boxes had been delivered, where they sat waiting for their owner's use. They went into each place with Van Helsing's tools, and they treated each box, and they kept count. And Mina kept the record, and Jonathan moved through the city with the particular set of his face that he had brought back from the castle, the watchfulness that did not turn off. They found most of them, not all. The Count knew they were looking. He was not passive. He was very old and very intelligent, and he had been planning this longer than any of them had been alive. He moved some of the boxes. He found ways to obscure his trail. He watched them the way they were watching him. The difference being that he had been doing this for centuries and they had been doing it for weeks. Mina helped in a way none of them had expected. The marks on her throat had created a connection, not a connection she had chosen, not one that Van Helsing was comfortable with, but real and useful in the specific terrible way of things that cost a great deal and are still worth having. She could feel the Count's presence at certain moments. She could sense the direction of him, the general orientation of where he was in relation to where she was. Van Helsing used this. He put Mina under hypnosis twice a day, at dawn and at dusk, and he asked her questions, and she answered them from the place that the connection had opened, and the answers gave them information. Not precise coordinates, not a street address, but something, a sense of movement, a sense of direction, enough to narrow the search. They kept working. They kept finding boxes. The Count ran. This was what they had not expected, that he would run, that the old patient thing that had sat in its castle for centuries would feel threatened enough by this small group of people to actually leave, to abandon his carefully prepared positions and his London plans and move. It spoke to either the effectiveness of what they were doing or the age of his survival instinct, this willingness to give up what he had built and go somewhere else, somewhere he had not been exposed. He went back toward the east, toward Transylvania, toward the castle. They followed. This part of the account is Jonathan's again. He writes it differently from the castle diary, not the careful observational tone of a man trying to maintain rational distance, but the direct, urgent writing of a man who has stopped trying to manage his fear and is simply moving through it. They took trains east, Mina and Jonathan and Van Helsing and John Seward and Arthur and Quincy Morris, the American who had loved Lucy and who was here because he had been there from the beginning, and leaving was not something he was willing to consider. 6 people following something very old across the map of Europe. The journey was hard. The weather got worse as they went east, as if the territory itself was defending its owner. They lost time. They lost ground. The Count had a head start, and he was moving with a directness and a speed that spoke of long familiarity with the roads, that spoke of someone who had made this journey before and knew every shortcut and every passage. They kept going. Mina's hypnotic state told them he was on water, moving east on a river. They calculated routes and sent riders ahead to intercept the cart that would collect him at the river's end, the cart carrying the last remaining box. the one box he had kept, the one box he had brought with him, the one remaining piece of home. They converged at the castle. Jonathan writes about the approach to the castle from the road below, seeing it from outside for the first time, seeing it the way a person who has been inside something sees it from the outside after, with a particular kind of knowledge that changes the appearance of things. It looked different from outside, smaller perhaps, or not smaller, but more fixed, more part of the mountain, less the overwhelming presence it had been on the night he arrived. Or perhaps he was different. He was different. The cart came up the road as the sun was going down. 6 of them, and a cart, and a box of Transylvanian earth, and a sun that was dropping fast behind the western peaks. And everyone who understood the stakes was doing the same calculation. About time, about how much light was left, and what happened when the light was gone. They intercepted the cart. The men with the cart fought. They were local men, hired men, men who had no idea what they were carrying or why these foreign people were trying to stop them. Men who were simply doing a job and were now in the middle of something they had not been prepared for. They fought, and the 6 fought back, and it was a real fight, an ugly human fight with knives and strength and the ground of the mountain road under everyone's feet and the sun still dropping. Quincy Morris was wounded. Jonathan got to the box. He got the lid open. Inside the box, the Count lay on the dark earth, and his eyes opened as the lid came off, opened to the dying light of the sun and the face of Jonathan Harker above him. And what was in the Count's eyes in that moment, Jonathan writes about carefully, because he wants to get it right. He says it was not fear. He says that centuries of existence do not produce fear of the kind that young things feel, the clean, acute fear of the unexpected. He says what was in the Count's eyes was something more like recognition, the recognition of a thing that has played a very long game and has reached the end of it and knows it. He says it might even have been, in some small and terrible way, relief. Jonathan did what needed to be done. Quincy Morris was sitting on the ground with his hand pressed to his side and the red coming through his fingers, and he watched it happen, and he said, when it was over, that he was glad he had lived to see it, that it was worth it. He died before they got him back down the mountain. He died with the last of the day's light on his face, and Arthur holding one of his hands, and John Seward holding the other, and he died as he had lived, which was with the particular uncomplicated directness of someone who had decided what mattered and had done it without regret. Mina writes the end of the account. She writes it years later, adding a note to the compiled record that she had kept so carefully, the record that had saved them and cost them, and that she still had, still kept, still sometimes read in the evenings when the children were in bed and the house was quiet. She writes that she looked at the castle in the moment after, in the stillness that followed the end of the thing they had been doing, and that the castle looked to her like what it was, an old building on a cliff, enormous and ancient and no longer inhabited by anything except the centuries of its own history. She writes that Jonathan took her hand. She writes that they stood there for a moment in the mountain air with the sun going all the way down and the stars beginning to appear above the peaks, and that she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Something so simple it was almost difficult to name. She felt safe. Not the absence of danger, not the removal of threat, not the resolution of a problem. Something more fundamental than those things. The particular feeling of standing in the world and knowing that the world, at this moment, contains nothing that is coming for you. She writes that it did not last forever. Nothing does. But it was real while it lasted, and real things that do not last forever are still real, and that has always been, she writes, enough. She closes the record, she puts it away. She goes to find Jonathan. That is the end of Dracula's story. Not a tidy end, not an end without cost. Quincy Morris is dead, and Lucy is gone, and Jonathan Harker still wakes sometimes in the night with the particular watchfulness of someone who has learned that what you do not see can still find you. But the count is gone. The 52 boxes are gone. London continues as London does, indifferent to what nearly happened to it. The millions of people going about their days without knowing what came close, what was averted, what 6 people did in the mountains of Transylvania on a cold autumn evening, so that the city they had left could keep being what it was. This is usually how it works. The things that protect us are mostly invisible to us. The dangers that are turned back before they arrive are the dangers we never know about. The people who stand between us and the dark do their work quietly and come home, if they come home, to ordinary lives that give no particular indication of what they have done. Mina knows, Jonathan knows, that is enough. Sleep now, you are in a safe place. You are in the ordinary world, the world without boxes of dark earth and ships with no crew and marks that do not heal. The dark around you is just dark, the dark of a night that contains nothing except the ordinary passage of hours toward morning. Close your eyes. The story is finished. Rest. There is something that needs to be said about Mina Harker that the account does not always make clear enough. She was the one who held it together. Not in the dramatic sense, not in the sense of physical bravery or confrontation or the kinds of actions that get noticed and remembered. She held it together in the quieter and more essential sense of keeping the record, keeping the information organized, keeping the people around her connected to each other and to what they were doing and why. She typed up Jonathan's diary when he could not bear to read it himself. She typed up her own. She typed up John Seward's phonograph recordings, listening to his voice on the machine and transcribing every word, hours of it, the careful clinical observations of a man watching something he did not fully understand happen to someone he loved. She organized all of it into a single document that could be read from the beginning and understood by someone who had not been there. This was not a small thing. In a situation where everyone was frightened and the fear was producing different responses in different people, where Arthur was grief-stricken and Jonathan was haunted, and John Seward was caught between his scientific training and what he was observing, and Van Helsing was carrying the weight of being the only one who fully understood the situation, someone had to be the thing that connected all of them. Mina was that thing. She was also afraid. She writes about this without dramatizing it, in the same honest, practical tone that characterizes everything she writes. She was afraid for Jonathan and for Lucy, and then for Lucy's loss, and then for the children in the churchyard, and then for herself, when the marks appeared on her throat and she understood what they meant. She was afraid, and she kept working. This is, Van Helsing said to John Seward, in a moment that Seward recorded and Mina later included in the compiled account without comment, the rarest and most valuable kind of courage. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to work despite it. Not the feeling of being unafraid, but the choice to act as if the fear is not the most important thing in the room. She had made that choice every day. Since Jonathan had come back from Transylvania, she kept making it. John Seward's diary deserves its own accounting. He was a doctor who ran a lunatic asylum, which means he was a man who spent his working days in the company of minds that had gone to places that ordinary minds did not go, and who had developed through this work a particular kind of patience and a particular kind of careful observation. He had learned to listen to things that sounded impossible and find within them the kernel of experience that was real, even when the interpretation of that experience was not. This served him well during the months of the Dracula account. He had also loved Lucy in his way, and she had chosen Arthur instead, and he had accepted this with a grace that Mina records with genuine respect, because accepting it gracefully was not easy, and he had done it anyway, and had remained Lucy's friend, and had been there when she began to decline, and had called Van Helsing because he did not know what else to do. He writes about Lucy's decline with clinical precision that is itself a form of grief, the grief of a doctor who cannot save the patient. He writes about each symptom with the careful notation of someone who is trying to find the diagnosis that will lead to the treatment that will save her, even as the symptoms accumulate in ways that no diagnosis he has available can account for. He writes about the night he understood that no diagnosis he had available was going to help. Van Helsing had asked him on one of their evenings at Lucy's bedside whether he was a man who could accept new ideas. Seward had said yes, he thought he was. Van Helsing had asked him to consider, as a doctor, whether the absence of a known explanation for a thing was the same as the absence of the thing itself. Seward had thought about this and said no, it was not the same. Van Helsing had nodded. He had said that this was the necessary first step, the understanding that not knowing the name of a thing did not make the thing not real. He said that they were going to encounter in the days ahead things that medical science in its current form did not have names for, and that Seward's job was to observe them with the same care and precision he brought to everything, and not to dismiss what he observed because it contradicted what he had been taught. Seward said he would try. He did try. He writes that trying was the hardest intellectual work he had ever done, harder than any examination or any research, the work of holding open a space in a trained and educated mind for something the training and education had specifically prepared him not to accept. He held the space. He accepted what he observed. He was there for all of it, the beginning and the middle and the end, and he kept his diary and he contributed it to Mina's compiled account, and in the years after he returned to his asylum and his patients and his work, and he was, according to those who knew him then, a different kind of doctor than he had been before, more patient with the impossible, more willing to listen to what could not be explained, more careful about the dark. Arthur Holmwood became Lord Godalming during the months of the account. His father died, as fathers eventually do, and Arthur inherited the title and the responsibilities that came with it. He writes about this in a few brief lines, sandwiched between entries about Lucy's decline, as if the fact of becoming a lord was a small and slightly inconvenient interruption to the main business of being present for the woman he loved. He was, of all of them, the one whose grief was most straightforward. He had loved Lucy, and she had loved him, and they had been going to be married, and then she was gone, and the grief of that was the ordinary grief of loss, comprehensible and real and terrible, in the way of all comprehensible and real terrible things. What was not ordinary was what came after, what Van Helsing told them, what was being asked of him in the churchyard. The gap between losing someone and what Van Helsing was describing was so wide and so strange that Arthur sat with it for hours before he could do anything, just sat with it and looked at it, the way you look at something that has arrived in your life, without asking permission and that you have no framework to receive. He crossed the gap. He did what needed to be done because Van Helsing had explained that it was the only way to give Lucy rest. And giving Lucy rest was the thing Arthur could still do for her, the last thing, and he was not the kind of man who did not do the last thing. He came out of the churchyard with John Seward's hand on his shoulder, and he was not the same man who had gone in, but he was still Arthur Holmwood, still the man who had loved Lucy Westenra, and that was enough to keep moving. He kept moving. He was there at the castle. He held Quincy Morris's hand at the end. He went home to England and became Lord Godalming in the full sense of the word, with all the duties and the properties and the responsibilities, and he discharged those duties with the particular steadiness of someone who has learned that the world is larger and darker than they knew, and has decided to be responsible within it anyway. Van Helsing. He is the hardest to write about because he is the one who knew. He was the one who arrived at Lucy's bedside and looked at the marks and knew what they were and what they meant and what was going to have to happen. He carried that knowledge alone for longer than was comfortable, longer than was perhaps entirely fair to the people he was not yet telling, because he needed them to be ready before he told them, and making them ready took time. He was very old. He does not say how old. He says only that he has seen things in his long career that prepared him for this, that the world had shown him its stranger edges on previous occasions, and that this was not the first time he had carried the weight of knowing something that others did not yet know. He carries the account of the garlic and the crucifix and the other things with a matter-of-fact quality that is its own kind of lesson, the lesson of someone who has made peace with living in an expanded world, a world that contains more than the comfortable modern version allows for, and who has found that the peace is possible, that it is possible to know what the dark contains and still function, still work, still be useful to the people around you. He teaches this by example to the group around him, not by explaining it, not by lecturing them on how to manage the impossible knowledge they are acquiring, by demonstrating it, by being the steadiest person in the room, in every room where the impossible is happening, by treating each new horror with the same calm professional attention he would bring to any difficult case. They learn from watching him. They become steadier. By the end, at the castle, they are all steadier than they were at the beginning. Van Helsing goes back to Amsterdam. He goes back to his university and his students and his research and his practice. He does not talk about what happened in England and Transylvania, not because he is ashamed of it or because he doubts it happened, because the people who need to know already know, and the people who do not need to know would not be helped by being told. He keeps his own counsel. He keeps working. Jonathan Harker came back from Transylvania the second time, different from how he had come back the first time. The first time he had come back broken in ways that showed, thin and quiet and watchful with the watchfulness of someone who has been somewhere very wrong. The second time he came back changed in a way that was harder to see from outside, but that Mina could see, because Mina saw everything about him. He was less afraid, not unafraid. He had been in too many places and seen too many things to be unafraid in any simple way. But the fear had found its proper place in him, had been assigned its proper proportion, had been put alongside the other things he knew and felt and carried. And the result was not a man without fear, but a man who could hold his fear without being held by it. He went back to his work. He was a good lawyer, and had been a good lawyer before the castle, and was still a good lawyer after it. And the work of the law, the careful management of documents and deadlines and the rights and obligations of people in relation to each other, was satisfying in the specific way of work that is useful and that you are good at. He did the work, and he came home to Mina, and they had a life, the ordinary life they had planned before Transylvania had interrupted the plan. And the life was good, not without shadows. There were nights. There were mornings when he woke with the watchfulness already in his eyes before he was fully conscious. There were moments when a particular quality of darkness or a particular sound brought him briefly back to somewhere he did not want to be. But the moments passed, and in the in-between, which was most of the time, he was Jonathan Harker, husband and lawyer and father, living an ordinary life in an ordinary world. He kept his diary current. He always would. Some habits, once started for the right reasons, become the right habit regardless of the circumstances that started them. He wrote things down. He made sense of the world. He kept going. There is one more thing to say before the story is entirely finished. The Count, in the moment at the end, when the box was open and the last of the day's light was coming in, and Jonathan was above him, said nothing. He did not plead. He did not threaten. He did not offer anything. No bargain, no deal, no exchange. He simply looked at Jonathan with those dark eyes and whatever was in them in that moment, and he said nothing. Jonathan thought about this afterward, wrote about it, came back to it in subsequent entries, trying to understand what the silence had meant, what it communicated, whether there was something in it that should have been said differently. He concluded eventually that the silence was itself the answer, that something which has existed for centuries, which has outlasted so many individuals and so many groups and so many attempts to end it, does not speak at the moment of ending, because there is nothing to say that has not already been said by the length of the existence itself. The Count had lived a very long time. He had seen many things. He had done many things, the kind of things that do not bear being described in any detail, the kind that the stories from the villages had been describing for generations, the kind that the ship's log had touched on the edges of, the kind that the children in the Whitby churchyard had come back from pale and confused and unable to quite remember. He had been all of that, and at the end, in the dying light in the mountains where he had lived for centuries, he was silent. It is, Jonathan writes in his final entry about the Transylvania account, the most honest thing he ever did. Good night. The story is over. The accounts are compiled and the record is complete, and Mina has closed the folder and put it away, and the house is quiet and the children are asleep, and Jonathan is there, and everything is exactly as ordinary as it was always supposed to be. This is what was fought for, the ordinary, the quiet, the safe dark of a house at night where the people inside it are not being hunted. You are in that kind of dark right now, the ordinary dark. Nothing in it that was not there before. Let it carry you the rest of the way. You have listened to the whole story. You have stayed with it all the way to the end. Now rest, sleep well. Something needs to be understood about London in this story, because London is not just the setting. London is the target. And understanding what the Count was planning to do in London, what he had been preparing for across all those years in the castle, makes the story darker and more important. London in the 1890s was the largest city in the world. More than 6 million people crowded into streets that ranged from the grand and wide to the narrow and dark, a city of extraordinary wealth and extraordinary poverty, existing in the same square miles, a city where a person could disappear and not be found for days, where the poor and the sick and the lost were simply lost, where the mechanisms of society for protecting people were still being built and were nowhere near complete. It was, from the Count's perspective, ideal. He had chosen it the way a predator chooses territory, with a thoroughness and a patience that spoke of very long thinking. He had studied the maps and the demographics and the social structures. He had understood that in a city that large and that disorganized, with that many people moving through its streets at all hours, including the dark hours, an entity that needed to feed and preferred not to be noticed could operate for a very long time without accumulating a pattern that anyone would recognize. The poor would be vulnerable. The sick, already pale and weak, would not look significantly different. The missing would be assumed to have moved on, or to have fallen into one of the many other fates that befell the poor of London without comment or investigation. He was not wrong about this. He had done the analysis correctly. What he had not fully accounted for was Mina's record-keeping and Van Helsing's knowledge, and the specific combination of people who happened to be connected and informed and motivated to act. He had not accounted for the fact that Jonathan Harker was a thorough man who kept a diary, and that Mina Harker was a thorough woman who compiled records, and that these habits would prove to be the mechanism of his defeat. The modern world, which he had studied so carefully in preparation for exploiting it, had produced, along with everything he had planned to use, a thing he had not expected. People who wrote things down, people who compared notes, people who, confronted with the impossible, chose to believe what they had observed rather than what they had been taught. These people had been harder to overcome than the 6 million. The 50 boxes tell the full scope of what was planned. 52 individual resting places spread across London and the surrounding areas, each one a location where the Count could rest safely through the daylight hours, each one far enough from the others that no single discovery would compromise the whole network. This was not a casual arrangement. This was infrastructure. This was the kind of planning that a general does before a campaign, or that a business does before opening in a new market. It was the planning of something that intended to stay, that had no exit strategy because no exit was anticipated. He had been in the castle for centuries. He intended to be in London for centuries. The idea of what centuries of this in London would have produced is not something that the account dwells on, because the people writing it were focused on what they needed to do and not on what they were preventing. But it is worth pausing on. Centuries. In a city that was already the center of an empire. In a city that connected through its trade and its politics and its people to every other major city in the world. In a city from which the next generation of leaders and thinkers and builders and travelers would emerge and spread outward. The implications are very large. Van Helsing understood the implications. This is part of why he moved with the urgency he did. Part of why he was willing to tell 6 people something that contradicted everything they knew, and ask them to act on it immediately, because the alternative to immediate action was not a delay. It was the establishment of something that would not be dislodged by anything available to them. Once it was properly rooted, they acted, they prevailed. The implications remained theoretical. London continued to be what it was, which was enormous and difficult and full of people going about their days, and the people going about their days had no idea what had been in their city for those months, what had fed in their streets, what had been turned back. They did not need to know. They were safe. That was what mattered. Mina's marks faded, not immediately, not all at once, but over the weeks after the castle, as autumn became winter and winter began to ease toward the following spring, the marks on her throat, those 2 precise points that had been there since the night the Count had come to their room, grew lighter, became harder to see, required direct examination in good light to find it all. By the spring, they were gone. She writes about this with characteristic understatement, a sentence noting that the marks had finally become invisible and that she was glad, and then moving on to the next thing. But Jonathan writes about it differently, writes about noticing one morning, in the light, coming through their bedroom window, that the marks were no longer visible, and the feeling that came with this, which he tries to describe and which he eventually calls simply the feeling of getting something back that you did not fully know you had given away. He writes that he held her hand. He writes that she looked at him with the expression he had thought about in the castle, the one that looked slightly annoyed at itself for being so glad. He writes that he was glad too. He does not apologize for being glad. There had been enough to be ungrateful for. He was glad. The summer after. Mina writes about it in a brief final addition to the account, dated nearly a year after the events in Transylvania. She writes that they had gone back to Whitby for a few days, Jonathan and herself, a brief holiday. She writes about the cliff top and the abbey and the view of the North Sea. She writes that they walked to the churchyard above the harbor. She writes about standing there in the late afternoon light and looking at the old tombs and the headstones and the grass growing between them, at everything ordinary and peaceful and still in the way of places where the living come to remember the dead. She writes that she thought about Lucy, not with horror, not with the specific complicated grief of what Lucy had become and what had had to be done. Just Lucy, the friend who had laughed easily and been generous and had loved Arthur Holmwood with the straightforward completeness of someone who knew what she wanted and was glad to have found it. She stood in the churchyard and thought about Lucy and let herself miss her properly, which she had not had time to do during the months when everything was moving, and missing her felt clean and sad in the right way, the way that grief feels when it has finally found its correct proportions. Jonathan stood beside her. The sea was very blue in the late afternoon light. The ruins of the abbey caught the sun on their old stones. The grass moved a little in the wind coming off the water. She writes that it was a very ordinary afternoon. She writes that ordinary was exactly what she had been hoping for. She writes that they walked back down the cliff to the town and ate dinner in a small restaurant by the harbor and talked about ordinary things, the kind of things that people who are building an ordinary life together talk about. Small plans and observations and the easy, comfortable conversation of people who know each other well and are glad of each other's company. She writes that Jonathan laughed at something she said. She writes that she had missed that sound, his laugh, had not heard it as often as she would have liked in the year past, and that it was good to hear it again, simple and genuine, the laugh of a man who has found something funny and is allowing himself to find it funny without reservation. She closes the entry there. She closes the account there. She puts the folder away. Outside the window of whatever room she is writing in, the world is continuing to be the ordinary world. The world without things coming for you in the dark. The world where a laugh is just a laugh, and a good dinner is just a good dinner, and the sea is just the sea. She is glad to be in it. She has earned the gladness. Final note. If you have listened to this from the beginning, from Jonathan's first diary entry in the towns where people looked away, all the way to Mina putting the folder away in the room, with the ordinary evening outside the window, you have heard one of the great horror stories ever written. Not because it is the most frightening. There are more frightening things. Not because the monster is the most terrible. There are more terrible monsters. Because it is the most human. Because what makes it frightening is not the Count, who is simply what he is, a very old thing that feeds and survives. What makes it frightening is the people around him. Jonathan keeping his diary in the castle, because writing things down is how he makes sense of the world. Mina organizing the records because someone had to, and she was the one who could. Van Helsing carrying knowledge that no one else would believe, because knowing the truth was not optional. Arthur doing the hardest thing, because giving Lucy rest was what he could still do for her. These are human things, recognizable things, things that most people in different circumstances and on a different scale have done or could imagine doing. The monster is terrible, but the people who stood against it are what the story is actually about. They stood against it. They prevailed. Remember that, in the dark, if the dark becomes difficult. People have stood against dark things before. They have prevailed before. Sleep now. The story is truly finished. And the dark you are in is the ordinary dark. The dark of a safe night in an ordinary world. And there is nothing in it that requires standing against. Just rest. Just sleep. You are safe. One more thing about the ship. The Demeter, it was called. The name of the ship that carried the Count from Eastern Europe to England. The name of a goddess, as it happens, which is one of those small ironies that history produces without intention. The log of the Demeter is part of Mina's compiled account, reproduced in full because she understood that it was important, that it was the clearest record of what the journey had been like, from the perspective of people who had encountered the Count, without knowing what they were encountering, without any of the context that Jonathan had assembled and that Van Helsing carried. They had just been men on a ship doing a job. The log begins routinely. Cargo loaded, course set, weather conditions noted. The first mate writes in the same matter-of-fact nautical shorthand that ship's logs use everywhere, the plain language of people who deal with the sea and have learned to be economical about it. Then the entries change. It happens slowly, over several days. A man reports having seen someone in the hold, among the boxes, in the dark below decks. The report is investigated, and nothing is found. The man who made the report is noted as having seemed frightened and is assigned less isolated duties for a few days. Then another man, different man, same report, someone among the boxes. The hold investigated, nothing found. The second man described as excitable, as seeing things, as needing watching. Then the first man is gone. No explanation, no evidence of falling overboard, no witness. Just absent from his watch in the morning, gone from a ship in the middle of the North Sea with nowhere to go. The log becomes less routine after this. The writing is the same handwriting, the same first mate, but the handwriting begins to show something, a slight irregularity, a pressure on the pen that was not there in the early entries. The entries themselves become longer, more detailed, as if the writer is trying to get everything down, to leave a record, because something in him has begun to understand that the record may matter more than the writer. More men go. Each disappearance is noted. Each investigation of the hold is noted. Each time nothing is found in the hold. Each time the boxes are there, all of them, undisturbed, and the hold is empty of anything that should not be there, and the men who look into it look carefully and come back up and report nothing and then sit very quietly for the rest of the day. The captain takes over the log from the first mate at some point. He does not explain why the first mate is no longer writing it. He just writes his own name at the top of the next entry and continues. He writes more plainly than the first mate, less professional distance, more of the actual experience coming through the language. He writes about the dark below. He writes about the sounds that come from the hold at night. Sounds that are not the sounds of cargo shifting in a seaway. Sounds that have a quality he does not describe, but that his choice of words around, his careful avoidance of naming, communicates clearly enough. He writes about praying. He writes, a particularly religious man before this voyage. He had been at sea most of his adult life and had the practical relationship with weather and danger that most sailors have, which is respect rather than faith, a sense that the world had power and you navigated it as best you could. He prayed on this voyage. He does not say whether he felt it helped. He keeps writing. He keeps the log. Even after everyone else is gone, he keeps the log, because keeping the log is what a captain does, and he is the captain, and he is not going to stop being the captain because of what is happening on his ship. He lashes himself to the wheel. His last entry is written in the light of whatever lamp was still burning in the wheelhouse. It is short. He writes that he can see land ahead, the coast of England, that they will make harbor soon, that he is glad for this, even knowing what it means, that whatever comes off this ship onto that shore will be someone else's problem, that he is sorry for this, but that he has nothing left to stop it with, and he would not leave the wheel, even if he did. He signs it. He writes his name and his rank, and the name of the ship, and the date, and then the handwriting stops. The pen was found still in his hand. He was found still at the wheel. He was the last man on the ship, and he had stayed at his post until the end, and the log was complete and accurate, and everything that happened was recorded, which is perhaps what he intended, perhaps what kept him at the pen as much as what kept him at the wheel. He left a record. Mina found it and included it. It is part of the account. It matters. Lucy's 3 men each grieved differently, and each carried the grief differently in the time after. Arthur, who had been going to marry her, grieved in the direct way that straightforward people grieve, fully and without management, and then, after the churchyard, with the particular complication of having done what was necessary, which sat inside the grief as both a weight and a strange small piece, because he had done the last thing, the thing that had given her rest, and knowing that helped even when knowing it was also terrible. He threw himself into his responsibilities as Lord Godalming afterward, the work of the title, the management of properties and tenants and obligations, gave him somewhere to put the energy that grief generates and that, if it has nowhere to go, turns into something that is not useful. He worked hard. He was, by all accounts, a good lord in the old sense of the word, attentive to the people who depended on him, responsible in his stewardship of what he had inherited. He never fully stopped missing her. Some things are not meant to be fully stopped. John Seward returned to his asylum and his patients, and found that the months of the Dracula account had changed his practice in ways that were difficult to articulate, but that his patients seemed to feel. He was more patient, as noted. He was more willing to sit with what could not be explained, to treat the experience of his patients with more respect, even when the interpretation they placed on the experience was not one that science could confirm. He was, colleagues noted, a better doctor. He kept his phonograph, he kept recording. He kept the habit of setting down what he observed each day in the precise sequential detail of a medical record, because that habit had been what made his contribution to Mina's account possible, and the account had been part of what had allowed them to prevail, and he did not abandon habits that had proven their worth. Quincy Morris had no afterword. He is the one the account honors most quietly, which is often how the most important things are honored. He appears in it before the events as a big, friendly Texan with good manners and an easy way about him. And he appears in it during the events as someone who is simply and completely present for all of it, who asks no more or less than anyone else and contributes his full measure without requiring that measure to be noticed. At the end, he is sitting on the ground in the mountain road with his hand pressed to his side and the light going, and he says he is glad he was there, and he means it, and then he is gone. He was 31 years old. He had crossed an ocean to help his friends. He is in the account because Mina put him in it, because she understood that accounts which leave out the people who paid the highest price are incomplete in a way that matters, are diminished by the omission. She put him in. He is in. He is not forgotten. The castle stood on its cliff after. The account does not say what happened to it, and this is perhaps correct, perhaps the right choice, to leave the castle where it is in the story, on its cliff at the end of the mountain road, its gates closed now, its towers rising against whatever sky is above them, its enormous old walls containing nothing now except the centuries they have always contained. It has been there a very long time. It will probably be there for a very long time more. Old things built of old stone in old places tend to persist. The human events that make them famous or infamous are brief, decades or centuries at most, and then the stone outlasts the events, outlasts the memory of the events, outlasts everyone who was there for the events, and simply continues to be stone on a cliff in a mountain range. The castle is stone on a cliff in a mountain range. Whatever it was the residence of, it is not that anymore. What it is now is a place in a story that Jonathan Harker wrote and Mina Harker compiled, and that has been read by people all over the world for more than a century since, passed from one reader to the next, from one pair of frightened and engaged hands to the next, because that is what stories do when they are true enough to matter. They keep going. They outlast the events that produced them. They outlast the people who were there. They keep getting told. You have just heard this one. Now rest, sleep. The story keeps going without you. You can pick it up again whenever you want. For now, let it go. Let the dark be just dark. Let the quiet be just quiet. Sleep well.